We have to pull way back if we're going to understand what's going on with Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, in 2025, so recently, this is just January, they surveyed 70,000 students across 257 campuses, and they found that 34% said violence can be justified to stop campus speech, and 70% said shouting down speakers is acceptable. So the left was once the bulwark of dissent, and now it polices it. If you dissent from the group norm, you get punished. It's regressive, it's anti-liberal, it's tribal, it's a with us or against us moral purity test. So the right, like the left, it began justifying suppression based on political disagreement. That's what's happening right now. The hypocrisy is flagrant and ugly on the right. If the right really wanted free speech, if they were really defenders of free speech, then the people on the right, to a man, would be up in arms about the idea that the FCC is leaning on ABC to do what the president wants. That would be abhorrent to them if they were coming from a principled First Amendment position. This is a developmental problem that we're facing. This is not a problem of right versus left. What if students were taught free speech developmentally? Welcome everybody to Integral Edge, hosted by Integral Life. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I am the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy. I also work as a developmental book coach. One of my current big projects there is helping Terry O'Fallon, who created the Stages model of development, helping her write her first book, which is really exciting and super cool. I also work as a developmental leadership coach and just basically working with leaders to become more fully human and to bring more of themselves into their workplace. So we have a big topic here today, and I suspect that if you lean hard right or you lean hard left, you're going to get irritated during this talk. As always, I'm trying to hold a both and perspective in this time of tremendous uncertainty and to really speak to the complexity that's arising here around us. So this talk has 8 major parts to it, and I'll announce each part so you have a sense of how far into the talk we are. I'm hoping to keep it about 45 minutes. We'll see how well I do. And again, really want to hear your questions and commentary afterwards. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start off by just defining what we're talking about. We're talking about, in this talk, the First Amendment. And let's just read the First Amendment. It is quite a mouthful. You might be surprised. The founders weren't very good at writing sentences, is one thing I've surmised after looking at the Constitution a number of times over these last couple of months. I gave a talk on the Constitution a few weeks back. But the First Amendment, here we go. Congress has 6 things in it. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. 6 things. So there's the Establishment Clause, no national religion, Free Exercise Clause, protection of your religion that you want to practice. The one we're talking about, the Free Speech Clause, protection from government censorship of speech. The Free Press Clause, journalists and media are protected from government control. The right to assemble, you can protest and gather in groups to protest. And the right to petition, you have the right to make complaints or seek remedies from the government. That's all there, okay, in the First Amendment. So it was ratified in 1791, and in essence what we could say is it prohibits Congress or the government from abridging the freedom of speech or the press. So as always, the Constitution, when we look at it, it's designed to protect the people from the government. And it makes sense if we take a historical look at what the founders were trying to do and break free from a monarchy and an oppressive system of government. As far as our topic today goes, there are 4 Supreme Court cases that are relevant. I'm not going to go into them. I'm not a legal scholar by quite a long way. I'll leave it to more competent people. But they're worth mentioning because they do influence the way the conversation goes. The first one is Schneck versus the United States in 1919, and this was the one that talked about a clear and present danger for speech. So, if you're inciting violence, your speech can be limited. If your free speech includes espionage, it can be limited. We have Bradenbury versus Ohio in 1969, and so this basically says that the doctrine of speech advocating illegal action, it's protected unless it's directed to inciting imminent lawless action. So imminent there is really key, right? So if I said, I think we, the people, need to overthrow our government and establish a blah, blah, blah. That's not imminent violence. That's more sort of theoretical violence. And so that would probably be protected. If I said we should meet on Tuesday and go attack the courthouse, that's imminent violence. That's not going to be protected. We have Watts versus the United States, also in 1969, and this was about hyperbole. If I say something like, "Oh my God, I'm so mad, I'm going to go, do X, Y, and Z to the governor," if it's obviously hyperbolic speech, an emotional speech, and not an actual intent for violence, that's protected. And then finally, the really important one here for our talk today, we have Virginia versus Black in 2003. And this was really around things like cross-burning. And what the court determined then was that we need to distinguish between a symbolic, expressive act and a threat. So symbolic acts are protected. So if I were to put a cross on my lawn and burn it as a protest against Trump's crackdown on free speech, that would be protected. If I was to take that same cross and point it towards my neighbor of color, that would be considered intimidation and a threat, and that would not be protected. In fact, I would get arrested. So Virginia versus Black was making that distinction between symbolism and threat. Okay. To be very clear, the First Amendment restricts the government from restricting free speech, not private companies. Private companies can do whatever they want. Twitter can moderate their content. YouTube can say they don't want videos about cats on their page. ABC can decide it doesn't want to have Jimmy Kimmel on. The First Amendment means the government can't do these things. And we're going to sort of dive down and pull that apart a little bit over the next few minutes here. But before we do, let's take a step back. Let's take a look at the 20th century. So roughly, post-World War II till the year 2000. And let's take a look at what the political movement was like through the 20th century as it relates to the First Amendment. So largely, there was a liberal alignment with free speech throughout the 20th century. So said another way, the liberals were largely defending and deepening free speech across the board. Some examples, we have the ACLU and progressive legal movement. So a very famous case was the American Civil Liberties Union defended Nazis' right to march in Skokie, Illinois in 1977. And this was a bunch of Jewish lawyers for the ACLU. It was a principled stand for free speech. So the idea there is that even though I disagree with everything you say and find it abhorrent, I will defend to the death your right to say it. That was very much a liberal point of view. We have the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, right through the 1960s. So there, conservatives were really trying to control speech and protest. And speech and protest were the key tools of the civil rights movement. So liberals often defended protest rights against state crackdowns, particularly in the South. And there was a famous court case, New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964, which protected press freedom in exposing civil rights abuses because it clarified actual malice for defamation for public officials. And Trump has been all over this recently, trying to sue people for companies, organizations for malice. And a couple of them have settled, right? And a couple have continued to fight. But the New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964, what that said was basically the press can go after public officials pretty completely. And the only thing that is illegal is if there's actual malice. So if they're actually it can be proven that you're trying to harm the public official by what you're saying, which is very hard to prove. So it's essentially a pass for the press to go after powerful figures. And if you recall with Trump, he didn't win any of these cases that he's brought against the media companies. I don't think he's won. He may have won one, but I think almost all of them, the media companies settled before it went to court. And I think right now there's a $16 billion case against the New York Times, but the judge dismissed it because of the New York Times versus Sullivan as the precedent and said it was just an absurd charge. Okay. Then finally, with the 20th century and the liberals, we have free speech on campus. So the liberals led the Berkeley free speech movement, and this basically allowed students to engage in political speech on campus. It allowed them to be dissentful and to go after the dominant cultural narrative around race, around the war in Vietnam, around all gender norms, all kinds of things. Well, what about the conservatives in the 20th century? So I'm old enough to remember growing up in the 80s that the conservatives were often on the news kind of obsessed with obscene and indecent material. So there are often cases that were brought that tried to ban pornography, that tried to censor lewd and lascivious books, that tried to restrict sex ed. There is a famous case, Miller versus California in 1973, which established the Miller test for obscenity. And this was really influenced by conservative calls for limits on moral grounds. Of course, we have the anti-communism of the McCarthy era. This was a abhorrent and radical rolling back of free speech rights. Conservatives supported suppressing communist speech completely, right? Dennis versus the United States in 1951. And there were things like loyalty oaths, blacklists, and surveillance that were justified as national security measures. So it was a pretty ugly time. And then we had religious and patriotic speech norms. So conservative efforts back then, and also today, sometimes push for mandatory prayer in school, for flag protection laws. So they want to ban flag burning. The Supreme Court struck it down in Texas versus Johnson in 1989. It's going back in front of the courts. But generally, the principle would be that since symbolic speech, which we just talked about, is protected, if I want to burn the flag as a symbolic act and not as an act of threat or intimidation, that's protected. And in fact, Trump recently issued an executive order on that. And the lawyers that wrote it were savvy enough to really try to be aware of that distinction when they wrote it. But it's essentially legal doublespeak. Okay, so in the 20th century, conservatives favored order and moral clarity. Liberals defended the rights to dissent and to provoke. So here's a question for you all. Does it seem like liberals are defending the right to dissent and provoke as a principled stand, regardless of the politics of the position? I would say no, as a general thing. Well, what about conservatives? No. So what happened? If liberals were the great defender of free speech as a principled stand, how have we gotten to this place where it's hard to say that liberals are really defending the right to dissent and provoke as a principled position regardless of the politics? Okay, so let's get into it. Second section. The Great Inversion, when the left turned censorious. Now, I've spoken a lot about this, so I'm going to go through this kind of briefly. If any of these things are of interest to you, you can simply go back and look at my last talk on DEI, should DEI survive? And I get into this in a lot of detail. So we're going to skip through this a little bit more quickly. But from the 1990s to the 2000s, there was the rise of identity as authority on the left. There was an academic shift. We had critical race theory that emerged from legal studies departments, mainly Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. And there were some core ideas that were introduced. We had that racism isn't just individual, it's systemic and it's structural. Now, structural, everybody saw. That's redlining, that's restricting money, that's making women wear skirts and have co-signers for their mortgages and their rent. But systemic is about beliefs. And what the left figured out was that the idea that beliefs can create the concrete conditions like redlining or denial of credit to women. So identity is actually quite important. Language is quite important. Beliefs are quite important because it's understood that these things actually create the conditions of racism, sexism, power differentials themselves. And there were a couple of core ideas here. Another one was intersectionality, which was really Kimberly Crenshaw's thing, which is that individuals are shaped by overlapping systems of oppression. So to be poor is bad, to be poor and black is worse, to be poor black and female is worse still, to be poor black female and trans is worse still, etc. And then power. So critical race theory, really the main claim is that disparities between majority and minority are always explainable by power, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, or other problematic internal belief structures that lead to actual problematic external structures. Okay. So the key point here is that from the 90s, really late 80s to the early 2000s, identity becomes central to knowledge and truth. Identity becomes central to knowledge and truth, which is called standpoint epistemology. And there's a linguistic shift that happens on the left. So they move from equality of opportunity to equality of outcomes. They move from merit to structural oppression. And they move from concrete rights to subjective experience. And in this time period, we begin to hear expressions begin to come online for the first time. And this is all relevant because we're going to talk about the First Amendment and about expression and about language and about power. And so we have to pull way back if we're going to understand what's going on with Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel. So one of the expressions in the 90s is that lived experience is the authority. Lived experience is the authority. Okay. If we steelman that, we can see where it's true. If a bunch of white people come into Lakota reservation and try to help, we probably want to talk to those people and get a sense of what their lived experience is rather than what we think their lived experience is, which would allow us very likely to help and assist and collaborate in ways that are much more effective. Lived experience is the reality. So when this is healthy, this is a postmodern, post-rational, egalitarian point of view, green and integral. It validates marginalized perspective, it expands empathy, and it surfaces systemic harm. But here's the problem. When it's rigid or absolutized, it can collapse into epistemic tribalism. That means that only X group can speak on this. That's a problem. It denies cross-perspective dialogue. And it says basically you can't question this because you haven't lived it. And it implies that subjectivity overrides objectivity. Feelings trump facts. So the beginning of the problem starts here. We have an insight that's emergent, that's egalitarian, pluralistic, post-rational, green and integral, 4.0 Ontario Fallon's model, There are powerful insights around how language and beliefs can shape power structures and shape societies. Powerful insights there. But when it's pushed and interpreted at a lower developmental level, it collapses into contradiction, hypocrisy, and easily falsifiable claims. So now we move on. The next decade, the 2000s to early 2010s, and here we see an explosion of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, universities, government agencies, corporations. We see mission statements for nonprofits and for-profits. They really explode. Inclusion, representation, belonging, psychological safety, equitable treatment. These all start to come into the mainstream dialogue. DEI becomes a profession, and a billion-dollar profession, massive growth in universities especially, but also corporations and agencies, right, through the government. Key concepts are inclusion, obviously, belonging, things like microaggressions, psychological safety. And, we get these training mandates that come in through corporations and through universities and through think tanks and things where the training mandates are often compulsory. And so people are basically forced to do these sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. And this goes on for the next almost 15 years. And the irony here, and I talked about this in the last talk, but just briefly, a 2022 meta-study by the Academy of Management reviewed 40 years of research and found that diversity alone doesn't consistently improve organizational outcomes. In fact, it can increase conflict and reduce cohesion if not paired with strong leadership and culture. And why that's the case will become obvious pretty soon. This is a developmental problem that we're facing. This is not a problem of right versus left. There's a well-known Harvard meta review that found that there's no consistent behavioral change for people following DEI training interventions. So it doesn't work. But what's the point? The point here is that now the 2000s to the 2010s, language becomes power. The use of and control of it are also power. So telling someone how to talk and how to think, that's power, right? And on the left, we begin to see this more and more. We begin to hear things like, and this is just the beginnings of it, right? It's beginning to bleed into the conversation that, well, disagreement just means that you're fragile. And maybe you have implicit racism or sexism, or you've internalized the patriarchy, or you've internalized white privilege. We begin to hear things like feelings are facts. We begin to hear things like, this is not up for debate. We hear things like, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And the idea that intent doesn't matter, reception does, that begins to bleed into the conversation as well, which is interesting, right? So let's break this down a little bit. Let's take a little sidebar here and go into intent doesn't matter, impact does, or reception does. Well, if we look at this from a healthy egalitarian, healthy green perspective, what they mean is that even if your intention wasn't to harm, your words might still land painfully. And that pain deserves attention. Okay, that's pretty reasonable, really, right? So there is an emphasis on relational sensitivity. It's not a bad thing. Hold space for others' lived experience. It's not a bad thing. It encourages curiosity over defensiveness. That's also not a bad thing. And it understands that harm can be real even if it's unintentional. Well, that's also a great thing. Okay, so this healthy, egalitarian, pluralistic perspective would say that intent matters, but the impact matters too. And let's talk about both. Great. So what's wrong? Well, the trouble is that not everybody makes meaning from that place of complexity and presumed good intent. We are all over the developmental spectrum. This is an integral podcast, right? So we are developmentalists. There are adults out there that make meaning from a power-based red position. There are ones that make meaning from an early rational or Umber perspective. There are ones that make meaning from a rationalist perspective. And so that statement, let me get it again so I have it. Intent doesn't matter, impact does. From a power-based kind of red thing, it's if I say I'm hurt, I get to punish you. This weaponizes harm to control or dominate. There's no accountability for my distortion or my misinterpretation of your intent. And it makes emotionality a tool of moral blackmail. So this means if you disagree with me, you're a threat, and any outrage that I feel is a license to retaliate no matter how I want. What about in traditional moralistic language? Well, they would say there's only one correct way to speak. Deviate and you're wrong or evil. So this is the absolutism of a traditional point of view. And we see this on the right and the left quite a bit, and we'll get into this in a little more detail in a minute. But this reduces speech to rules and purity tests, ignores complexity, context, and good faith error, and it makes the reception a litmus test of your morality. So dogma replaces dialogue. And again, we see that on the right and on the left, both doing it. And then we have an early rational hijack, this sort of rationalist dismissal, and we see this on the right and the left as well, where only intent matters, feelings are irrational. This would be from the right. So they would mock emotional harm as hypersensitivity, prioritize intent over shared meaning, and treat empathy as a weakness or distraction. And on the left, they would polarize the other way. They would polarize towards, well, all that matters is intent. So the result is a cold, detached analysis and something that's blind to the social field. And as we said, when it's applied as intended, then both matter, right? Intent reveals my inner framework and my inner awareness. Impact reveals the external field and relational consequences. And dialogue reveals where there's the mismatch. That can be repaired. It's not super complicated. So too often on the left, the slogans can imply that speech is harm and not expression, especially if the speaker is in a place of perceived power. So through this period up into 2016, the left is making really complex distinctions and seeing nested truths. So it's very complex stuff. They're seeing these complex distinctions around power and nuance and speaking and sort of being aware of the speaker's field and their biases and aware of the receiver's field and their biases. And there's a good faith attempt here to really bring a lot of nuance and complexity into the space. But listen, here's the problem. It's over the heads of most people, especially high school kids, especially college kids, who reduce it to power, moral absolutism, or a simplistic either-or rubric. So the seeds are set now to potentially things not go so well. But we probably would have found our way through it. But what happened? Well, in 2016, Donald Trump gets elected. This is point number 3. Section 3, the Trump era, chaos as catalyst. So very simply, Trump's rhetoric inflamed the left and gave oxygen to the cancel culture dynamics. So progressive institutions, universities, think tanks, they began tightening their speech norms in reaction. And the reason was the speech policing on the left, it was escalated really because it was trying to contain what it perceived as fascist creep and hate normalization. And, let's just get into a little bit of what Trump did so we don't forget. 2016 to 2020. Here's just a few things, right? He equated criticism with censorship. So he blurred the line between speech about power and speech as power. And he weaponized the language of free speech and always to insulate himself from accountability. Very importantly, he destabilized the concept of truth, right? So you guys all remember in 2016, he was always talking about the fake news. He discredited journalism, but not just as flawed, but as fundamentally illegitimate. He introduced a post-truth rhetoric where speech becomes performative, right? For Trump, it's if I say it, it's true. And this is pure power-based stuff. He delegitimized independent sources of truth, the media, science, independent agencies, courts, right? Anything that went against his truth, he delegitimized that. So he's really helping to push the culture into a post-truth world. Trump's speech acts basically as a dominance ritual, right? He interrupts people, he mocks people, he talks over them, he name calls them. And this creates a culture of conflict over clarity, impulse over deliberation, and it devalues principled mutual engagement. And a bunch of his followers mimic him. So let's not forget he called the mainstream press the enemy of the people. He suggested that broadcast licenses be revoked for outlets that were critical of him, like NBC in 2017. He banned certain reporters from press briefings. He floated ideas about expanding libel laws to protect himself. And basically, he chilled the climate for adversarial speech, especially within government institutions. People began to keep their heads down. Right? So it was a little dangerous to speak openly and freely about the new president. So I want to be really clear about this. I've seen some integralists really, in my opinion, project complexity on the Trump. Trump is not an integralist. Trump is not a rationalist. His language is traditionalism and power mixed together. His speech is loyalty-based, honor-based, and power-centered. Truth is what strengthens the tribe, and disagreement is betrayal. That was as true in 2016 as it is in 2025. He's completely bypassed rationalist norms for dialogue, rational consistency, rules-based dialogue, institutional neutrality. Completely bypass those, and in so doing, undermine them. And so what happened? 2016, 2017, by 2018, his chaos triggered a pluralistic or egalitarian overreaction. And identity-based speech policying, a moral fragility, and suppressive overreach began to really blow into the scene. And so we have this complicated dance. It's not like the liberals just lost their minds, right? I explained the context that was happening on the left to set this up. And then we have Trump comes into power and basically puts everything into a blender. And we end up at now the fourth point of this talk, which is post-George Floyd, when the norms collapse, 2020 to 2023. Okay, this isn't that long ago, and I think we all remember how painful and weird this was, this time to live through. So speech becomes a safety threat. This is a big thing post-George Floyd. So speech is now about safety. Words are now actual violence, not free speech. And there's all sorts of things begin to happen, right? the Me Too movement goes into a pretty ugly overreach where speech is policed, where allegations equal career destruction. where due process gets completely sidelined. George Floyd gets killed, and we have protests blow up all over the place, and we begin hearing these ideas that were percolating on the left now blow into the mainstream. Silence is violence. White fragility, right? Privilege equals complicity. Words equal actual violence. And look, I don't have to tell you that if words equal actual violence, then violence against people who speak words is justified. I mean, that's just an obvious logic train. It's a very dangerous logic train. So there are nuances here, right? Silence is violence. Is there truth that, like, if I just live my life and I don't speak kind of truth to power, I don't speak up against what I see as injustices, is that silence? I mean, is it violent? No. But is it empowering injustice or allowing injustice to continue unabated? Yes. You know, you could say, you know, not speaking up makes you arguably morally complicit in what's going wrong in the world. That would be a reasonable green progressive critique of someone's inaction. But silence is violence. That's tribalistic. That's moralistic, right? It means that you are compelled to speak or you're immoral. You're violent, right? You choosing to not speak up means you're actually violent. These are not very true, and they're not very helpful. Okay, so throughout this time, we have academic conformity and suppression, right? There's Evergreen College and Brett Weinstein, and you know he and his wife get sort of thrown out of the college. There are fire surveys, which is the foundation for individual rights and expression, and they find in 2022 that 1/3 of faculty self-censor out of fear of their students, and 90% report that they self-censor in at least some settings. 90% self-censor in some settings because they're afraid of the reactivity of the kids that they're teaching. They don't want to get run out on a rail for saying the wrong thing. Police speeching has now become a real thing. Okay, so why does this matter? We're talking 5 years ago, right? Well, here's why it matters. Because universities, places where kids get educated, they are overwhelmingly liberal. They are massively liberal. You know, some departments 42-1, Democrat versus Republican. It's well established that universities are extremely left-leaning, period. I've given talks on that too. Well, why does that matter? Well, here's why it matters. Because FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, in 2025, so recently, this is just January, they surveyed 70,000 students across 257 campuses. And they found that 34% said violence can be justified to stop campus speech. And 70% said shouting down speakers is acceptable. 34% said that violence can be justified to stop speech. 3/4 said that shouting down speakers is acceptable. I mean, folks, this is proof of a major problem. This feeds directly into Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel. What this says is that illiberal principles this says that liberal principles have been hijacked by pre-rational young minds because this stuff is over their heads. The fact that a big majority of students think that it's okay to shout down a speaker you don't like, that is not good for a free society, right? Back in my day, we were very much taught that you defeat a bad idea with a better idea, that you don't shout people down, you listen to them, you do your research, you do your homework, and you defeat their ideas with your own. That debate, talking, shows that some ideas are flawed, some ideas are better, and you would never shout somebody down. I mean, what's the point of that? If you don't let people speak, words are not actual violence, and so if you don't let people speak, then the only recourse you allow them is actual violence. That's the world we're living in now. Okay, let's take a little sidebar. So rather than shouting like an old man about what's wrong with the world, what if students were taught free speech developmentally? So building it stage by stage. Let me just give a little overview of what that might look like, okay? Kids in high school, a lot of kids in college, they are conformist socialized, right? They're making meaning as part of a group. They don't have a group, they are a group. So speech then is governed by moral order and authority. Free expression is acceptable only if it aligns with the group's sacred values. Dissent or disruption is seen as disloyal. So this comes down to, look, you can't burn the flag because I find it offensive on the right. It comes down to, on the left, if you don't use pronouns for people, that's actual violence against someone and you're anti-trans. Moral absolutism. So we know that. So we want to walk them up through a rationalist, truth-seeking perspective where free speech is seen as the engine of progress, right? So we want to teach them that debate and data and falsibility are the keys to understanding free speech. That speech isn't sacred. Suppressing it is dangerous because it blocks access to competing ideas, slows intellectual evolution. Free speech is what makes science, journalism, and democracy work. This needs to be taught and defended at the high school and university level. And the universities are often awash in these progressive values, and so that means that they're all about empathy and inclusion. So students learn that speech has impact, which I just talked about, especially on marginalized identities. So they become more attuned to tone, context, historical trauma. So, but even mature pluralism, postmodernism, it still supports free speech. It just calls for sensitivity and care alongside of it. The problem is that many students are skipping this rationalist part entirely. So they leap from their traditional moralism into a very distorted pluralistic view. And they enforce it with a power-based energy. They use outrage and force to control others. And so what you get is words equal violence, silence equals complicity, offense equals harm, dissent equals oppression. So these kids are not progressing. They're fusing moral rigidity with tribal aggression, and they're calling it compassion. And then we end up with 3/4 of college students today think it's okay to shout down someone who you don't like, because it's not a rationalist. It's a pre-rational position. Nothing egalitarian about that at all. So the left was once the bulwark of dissent, and now it polices it. If you dissent from the group norm, you get punished. It's regressive, it's anti-liberal, it's tribal. It's a with us or against us moral purity test. There's little difference between this and having a state religion. Okay. We're still in the 2020 to 2003 period here. COVID. All right, everybody? COVID. Now, I mean, if you haven't read the Twitter files, this was very problematic. The Biden administration and the federal agencies under their power, they basically put pressure on Twitter, on YouTube, on Meta, on all these organizations to make sure that they flagged anyone or anything that was questioning vaccine mandates, questioning the dominant narrative, offering alternative scientific perspectives. There was the censoring of voices, right? They tried to, try to take down Joe Rogan. But things that a Joe Rogan was talking about were taken off of YouTube, were taken off of Twitter. Scientists, doctors, public intellectuals were suspended, right, or shadow banned for views that later proved to be valid or at least debatable. Right? I mean, I was going through this. I was a single guy living alone. I kind of wanted to know what was going on. I wasn't trying to protect my family. My parents lived across the country, like I wasn't living with grandma. I was like, hey guys, what's going on here? I don't have a lot of fear going on with me. And there was really a chilling effect here where there was a precedent where dissent from official narratives is treated as misinformation, not based on open dialogue or debate, right? But there's a coordination between state actors, the Biden administration, and private platforms, right? This was pretty close to straight up speech suppression. Now, the government didn't mandate it, so it didn't technically, they weren't banning the speech technically, but they were leaning heavily on media companies to suppress certain narratives that might cause vaccine hesitancy or that might cause doubt. It's very illiberal, okay? And to be frank, it really fucking pissed me off at the time. And I've talked about it quite a bit. So as we come to the end of this sort of period, the sort of takeaway is that by 2023, we're living in a world where language is no longer just descriptive, it's moral. If you deviate, you risk professional and social punishment. The left used to stand for protecting dissent and freedom of any expression as a principled position, but between 1990 and 2020, it's really started to change. Okay, point 5 and point 6 are going to be about the right. So if you think I'm really like playing up the right here, listen up, because the right is really no better. So let's talk about the right's reaction between 1990 and 2020. We'll just give sort of an overview here. Okay, so basically like from the early 90s to the 2000s, the right, the conservatives, they were still fixated on obscenity and flag burning and school prayer and decency laws. And it was really only after Obama that the cultural momentum began to shift, and the right began to reframe itself as the victim of liberal orthodoxy and censorship. So there were some key shifts here. 4, really. There was the campus backlash narrative, where conservatives, and I think rightly, they claimed exclusion and harassment in left-leaning universities. Tim Urban wrote a great book recently where he really gets into that. There were safe space critiques that conservatives really seized on the left's hypersensitivity and argued that discomfort is not harm and that offense is part of democracy. The conservatives said, look, facts don't care about your feelings. And it was a slogan, right? That I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? Facts don't care about your feelings. We don't have to unpack it. And cancel culture language began to emerge, right? So cancel culture began to happen, and the right really began to paint itself as the savior when it comes to free speech, and the left as authoritarian and anti-free speech. So, and they were often using, I would say, early rationalist arguments. They really weren't using mature rationalist arguments, but if you look at what was going on, the right was really reacting to some of the overcorrections of the left and some of these tribalistic and moralistic elements. And they were reacting with sort of a call to accountability. But they really weren't making a call for principled free speech with no exceptions. They were really sort of reacting here. So the key figures were like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson and a young Charlie Kirk who was coming up. And there was a great talk I saw by Jordan Peterson, who I really enjoy. But someone asked him, it was Channel 4 interview on the BBC, and the woman asked him, why does your right to free speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended? And he said, that's easy. Sometimes in service of the truth, I have to risk offending you. And he said to the interviewer, look, you haven't really cared about offending me during this interview. You've been digging around and it's been quite unpleasant. And good for you. You're trying to figure out what's really going on here, as you should. And so to get to the truth, you have to risk being offensive to me, which you're being, and good for you, because that's what we want to allow, right? Knocks it out of the park. It's a fantastic answer. Why you need to allow space for people to be uncomfortable in free speech and not censor it. Okay, well, then what do we have? Well, then we have 2020 to 2025, and here we have the illiberal churn of the right. So if the left overreached in the name of safety and justice, then parts of the right began to overreach in the name of free speech and undermine their own principles in the process. So, Trump has been really going from defending free speech to being really all about retaliatory censorship. That's what's been going on since he came back into office. He's threatening broadcast license over jokes and criticism, right? Obviously the whole Jimmy Kimmel thing. He's using the FCC and the Department of Justice or public funds as speech levers. He's weaponizing anti-woke laws that restrict classroom content, like banning critical race theory. I'm not for banning anything, right? Banning anything is an illiberal idea. Obviously the FCC chair under Trump just said about Jimmy Kimmel, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. Right? It's not even a veiled threat. It's a threat. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, she said that, she tweeted that they will absolutely target you for hate speech, which is legally incoherent. And she had to backpedal because it is legally incoherent. Hate speech is protected unless it's a true threat. It's so anti-free speech to say something like that, And what they mean is, Trump wants to go after speech that he doesn't like as hate speech, but hate speech is protected. So it's going to be really curious to see where this ends up. So the right, like the left, it began justifying suppression based on political disagreement. That's what's happening right now. The hypocrisy is flagrant and ugly on the right. There are state laws that punish companies for boycotting Israel. Companies should be able to boycott whoever they want. That's an expression of their free speech. Targeting public school teachers and librarians for ideological content. Censoring drag shows, books, right? Private corporations with progressive policies, right? Trump sued law firms for what they've done. He's sued multiple news organizations as a private citizen, trying to collect damages for libelous content he claims against himself. And so what we have here from a developmental framework, we have traditional moralistic, authoritarian ideas of free speech that are wrapped in a rationalist language of freedom. But instead of advancing discourse, it mimics the censoriousness it critiques. So free speech becomes less of a value and more of a weapon. Okay, so if we take a step back here and we look at the horrible assassination of Charlie Kirk, which was repugnant and terrible, right? Reprehensible. And we look at the disgusting, morally abhorrent reaction by many people on the left who celebrated his death. I hope you can see in this talk that the reason many on the left probably supported his assassination is because they've taken in these ideas. 34% of college kids think violence is justified against speech, and 3/4 think that it's okay to shout somebody down. These recent would-be assassins or actual assassins have all been young people, all been young men, steeped in this kind of indoctrination and thinking. It's not a coincidence. We have the right's reaction to Jimmy Kimmel. If the right really wanted free speech, if they were really defenders of free speech, then the people on the right, to a man, would be up in arms about the idea that the FCC is leaning on ABC to do what the president wants. That would be abhorrent to them if they were coming from a principled First Amendment position. And they would be horrified that the Attorney General said that she was going to go after hate speech. Whose hate speech? What's hate speech? You know, one person's hate speech is another person's truth, right? As long as you're not inciting actual imminent violence, it's protected speech. Now, your employer can fire you, but your employer can fire you if, you know, they think you have a haircut that doesn't befit the company image, right? Employers have a lot of First Amendment rights to fire and hire at will. Okay, so let's take one final thing here. We're going to do the seventh part of this, which is a developmental analysis. So we'll walk through how the different stages of development shape views on free speech, which I've already talked about. Just want to say it once more. So if we're at red, if we're power-based, if we're around personal dominance, here speech equals force. It's about who yells the loudest, who mocks the hardest, who dominates the frame. This is a lot of Trump stuff, right? Fake news, enemy of the people, nicknaming opponents, his constant assertion of himself as the truth source, his shit tweeting at 3 a.m., saying he hates his political enemies, threatening to send the Justice Department after those who are guilty of hate speech, right? No filters, no norms, right? It's just a mess. Now, on the left, we've seen this too, right? In the left, this is when it gets reduced to this ugly tribalism, when it gets reduced to sort of like, if you don't speak up, you're violent. Where if you disagree, you are complicit in actual injustice, right? These are also red, power-based, personal dominance, controlling. When we go up to traditionalism, to the rules and values there, amber, this is about loyalty and moral order, right? This is tradition, shared values, moral clarity. Free speech is okay as long as it upholds the moral fabric as I see it. If your words threaten that, then you're out. McCarthy-era blacklist, conservative pushes for school prayer, bans on burning the flag. You must use pronouns or else you're anti-trans. If you're a white male, you have to listen. These sorts of things, right? These are loyalty and moral order. So speech equals obedience to shared norms. Not really free speech. Then we have the rationalist point of view, which the rationalist point of view, by the way, is getting squeezed on all sides. There's very few people that are actually still really coming from a fully rationalist point of view because they're getting attacked by the left and by the right. This is the Enlightenment model, right? I've talked about this, right? Rational debate, universal rules, neutral institutions, right? Moving towards those ideals. They know that they're just ideals. But free speech is a procedural right even for unpopular, offensive, or disturbing speech. The ACLU defends Nazis. The Berkeley free speech movement. The SCOTUS cases that expand the First Amendment, right? Classic liberalism. It's about rules, not about feelings. And there have been some wonderful people on the right that have absolutely been behind this. Wonderful people on the right, wonderful people on the left, right? There is a big consensus. And there have been people like I read the National Review to help to sort of supplement my perspectives in addition to reading things like the Post and the Times and independent media. The National Review, which is a very conservative outlet, they are appalled at Donald Trump, right? They're appalled at what he's doing to free speech. They're taking a very principled, rationalist point of view, and they're not at all drinking the Kool-Aid along with a lot of other Republicans. They're really standing up for principle, right? That's classic liberalism. It's about the rules. It's not about the feelings. It's not about the sides. Okay. And then at green, at pluralism, at post-rationalism, right? They worry about identity and harm reduction. So speech is never just speech to them. It's a form of power. People don't come to conversations with equal standing. There's history, there's trauma, there's identity. They all shape how words land, right? So the healthy version of that is if someone's been silenced their whole life, what sounds like just an opinion to you might feel like erasure to them. Or if your words reopen wounds, even unintentionally, it matters. So it tries to reframe free speech not just as a right, but as a relational responsibility, right? It asks things like, are we creating conditions where everyone feels safe enough to speak? Are we listening across differences? Or are we dominating the space without knowing it? And so in this light, like DEI training and safe spaces and trigger warnings, they were meant not to censor, but to build environments where more people could participate fully. But because so few of the people advocating this were able to hold a genuinely post-rational point of view, and because so many of the people that they indoctrinated into this were pre-rational, it's been a fucking shit show, which I just went into, okay? And so where do we end up? Where we want to look at free speech, right? If we want to really take a mature position and really be all alone in it, then what we would say is that free speech is a living polarity, right? It's freedom and responsibility. It's not freedom or responsibility. It's obviously both, right? We should probably ask, what are the hidden power dynamics in how we speak? How does speech interact with emotion and truth and culture? Can we hold dissent and care at the same time? So we hear this with really good mediators, really good bridge builders, with deep systems thinkers, right? So what's needed next? We are at the end. Part 8, what's needed next? Well, right now we have freedom is being shouted without responsibility. We have responsibility is demanded without freedom. And we have truth is whatever confirms our side's position. Hypocrisy all around people. A lot of hypocrites on the left around the Charlie Kirk thing. A lot of hypocrites on the right around the Jimmy Kimmel thing. Hypocrisy is afoot, and it's everywhere. Free speech is not a weapon or a shield. It's a living tension. It's a living tension between freedom and responsibility. So if we look at the freedom pole, that obviously protects dissent, creativity, and innovation. It's obviously vital for a democracy, as Jordan Peterson said, right? It's vital to get to the truth. The danger is that it can lead into nihilism and trolling and hate. On the responsibility side, right, we want to protect people from harm and trauma and erasure. Responsibility is really important for community building and dignity. But the danger here is censorship, fragility, thought policing. One without the other becomes toxic. Both together become transformative. So free speech is not a culture war issue. It's a developmental challenge. The question is not whose speech should we suppress, but can we grow into the kind of people who can hear each other even when it hurts? That's the invitation. So once again, everybody, thank you very much for joining me here on Integral Edge, and thank you to Integral Life for hosting it. Thank you to Corey, who's always so helpful in helping me organize my thoughts around this. He and I had a beautiful argument with each other. We were really literally shouting at each other. I mean, I was shouting. I don't know if we were texting, but it was a lot of emotional energy, and it was beautiful. It really helped me get clear on the places where, boy, there's so much emotionality bound up in this for all of us. I had to do a lot of work to get my head out of my rear end for this talk and to really try to find the complexity here, right? And see if we can find a through path of mutual accountability on the right and on the left, because, we're all in this together. It's our country. It's our world, right? I know some of you are listening from the UK and other parts of Europe, but I know you all are having a lot of the same problems that we're having here in the US. And it's up to us. It's up to us to be a force for reason and empathy, and to hold our side accountable as the other side, not in a hateful, moralistic way, but really calling people back or calling people up to reason, starting with a healthy, orange, fourth order, rationalist defense of free speech and why that matters. As Jordan Peterson said so eloquently, we have to risk offending people in order to get to the truth. I think we can leave it on that note. Thank you all very much. See you in 2 weeks.